Okay, it's on record, video recording mode, and it's just wait the tape. For some reason, there it's in focus now. We're ready to go.
All right. Bio 100, DL01. Today's Wednesday, March the 26th, I believe. And 5th. Is it 25th? Huh, how about that? And we're going to work and talk a bit about the endocrine system tonight. And that's the only chapter that we're doing this week, I believe. Is that right?
I don't know.
Yes, I think it is. Okay. This endocrine system, along with the nervous system, these two are identified as the two primary organ systems that worked and helped to maintain homeostasis in the body, and they work sort of in concert with each other. And just some general characteristics of the endocrine system. It's made up of glands, and these glands secrete hormones, and these hormones are carried, most of them anyway, are carried into the bloodstream throughout the body, and they have effects on target cells. Okay? We have, well, I guess we should start with just the types of hormones that we have. We have 5 different types, and they exert their effects a little bit differently. For instance, the first type we'll talk about are steroid hormones. And because they are lipid rich, they're able to diffuse pretty easily through the plasma membranes of target cells, enter into the nucleus, and actually bind to the DNA and have a direct effect on gene expression. When I say gene expression, I mean it gets either turned on or turned off. If a gene is turned on, then a particular polypeptide is then synthesized, okay? Some example of these steroids are formed from cholesterol, so they're cholesterol based. All right, and some examples are like estrogens, progesterone, testosterone, aldosterone, estrogens, testosterone, aldosterone, I believe, and cortisol. And we will identify where these come from, where they're produced, and then the target organs. Okay, second type of hormone that we have are amines. And if you remember the basic structure of a protein, you have one end of an amino acid is the amino end. You have a central carbon atom, a hydrogen, and you have an R group. One end is a carboxyl group, and then in the other end you have the amino end. Okay, and this is the amino end. So this is why these are like protein hormones. They're made from protein, okay? And some examples of those, they're formed from amino acids, which make up polypeptides or make up proteins, and epinephrine, norepinephrine. Some examples of these, epinephrine, or adrenaline, if you will. Norepinephrine. And we have thyroid hormones. Okay, MONES. Third type that we have are what they call peptides. All right, and these also are synthesized from amino acids. All right, they include ADH, oxytocin. ADH is an anti-diuretic hormone. and oxytocin. Oh, we have thyrotropin releasing hormone. And we'll see, again, how these exert their effect. And we won't have a chance to go through each individual hormone because that will take too long, but what we'll do is we'll address some general concepts about these, how they work. For instance, the steroid hormones have a different mechanism of action than either the amines or the peptides. We have glycoproteins, as the name implies, with some sugar attached to proteins, and these include FSH, LH, or follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, the name, follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone, and we'll look, hopefully we'll get a chance to look at the different effects on men and women, and thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay. And then these polypeptides and proteins is the last. And this is just to categorize them. And again, being synthesized from amino acids, these things that make up proteins. This chart is in the book, but. And some of these include PTH and growth hormone, parathyroid hormone, and GH growth hormone. All right. And parathyroid hormone. Now, they categorize these just basically by structure and what they're made from. The steroid hormones, again, they act in a different way than the amines and the peptides, glycoproteins, and so forth. And we'll talk about that. There is a classic mechanism by which these other hormones, other than the steroids, work, and it involves what they call the second messenger mechanism, second messenger hypothesis, and we'll go through that step by step. But just to start, these steroid hormones being made from cholesterol, which is a lipid, and they are able to fairly easily diffuse through the plasma membrane and again into the cytoplasm, then eventually into the nucleus, and have so they diffuse through the plasma membrane and have a direct effect on gene expression, whereas these others do not. Okay, so, for instance, where I'm teaching now during the day, during our teenage years and adolescent years, our testosterone levels, especially this time of year in the spring, in these young boys are off the charts. And so they're growing at a very rapid rate. And so their levels of testosterone are very high. And so they're able to have a direct effect on the young person's DNA right away, to stimulate protein synthesis, stimulate their growth of muscle, bone, and all the secondary male sex characteristics, facial hair, and what have you. On the other hand, these amines and these protein-based hormones, they work in a different way, and that's this is an important part because I know there's more than a few references made to it, particularly on this quiz coming up, but they operate by a mechanism or by a, that's known as the second messenger mechanism. All right, so when these hormones are released into the bloodstream, and oh, by the way, endocrine, endo, means inside. So these are hormones that released their, or these hormones travel directly in the bloodstream and travel throughout the body and have an effect on specific target organs. So when we talk about this second messenger mechanism, first thing to do is identify what's the first messenger in this process. And the first messenger is the hormone itself, whatever that hormone may be. Okay, and so it circulates through the bloodstream and will bind specific receptors on target organs. If we recall that the plasma membrane of our cells is about 50%, roughly 50% fat, phospholipid, and about 50% protein. And many of those proteins are embedded in the plasma membrane, and many of them serve as surface receptors, i.e. for these hormones. So what you have is you have a hormone traveling through the blood. It makes its way to a particular target organ. It binds to a receptor and will turn on, if you will, the second messenger. And there's a good diagram on this on page 345 of our textbook. Okay. So when the second messenger in this particular mechanism, well, the hormone binds, excuse me, and that the binding of the hormone you can kind of follow this along. It binds a membrane receptor, and then that will activate an enzyme known as adenylate cyclase. And I would put little asterisks by that enzyme, adenylate cyclase. And what that enzyme does is it will catalyze or bring about the synthesis of this so-called second messenger, which is often abbreviated CAMP, or cyclic
Please
adenosine.
pronounce it again. Adenylate.
Adenylate.
Adenylate. Okay.
Yeah, adenylate cyclase. Cyclic adenosine monophosphate. Okay, so we get the hormone that binds, this enzyme is activated, this second messenger is then synthesized, the cyclic AMP, and it is synthesized from ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And we're fairly familiar with the ATP molecule being the body's energy storing molecule, or the energy currency of the body, if you will. So this stuff is always around. We hope anyway. So after the binding and the activation of this enzyme, the cyclic AMP is produced. All right, and this is all right inside the plasma membrane. Okay. And then that the cyclic AMP, you'll see if we look in the activates existing proteins inside the plasma.
Is this those steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5
Yes.
on page 344?
Yeah, and you'll see that it activates a series of proteins, and this brings about the characteristic effect of that particular hormone. And we'll keep it kind of simple like that. Without trying to get too complicated. Okay. For instance, when we talk about thyroid stimulating hormone, working by this mechanism, after the CA, this second messenger, the cyclic adenosine monophosphate, activates these proteins inside a cell in the thyroid gland, then that cell will start to produce thyroid hormone, either T3 or T4, or T4 and then T3. Okay? So this is the so-called, and it's really not much more complicated than that. There is a G protein, that's just what they call it, that is activated when the hormone binds a receptor. And this hormone receptor complex with that G protein is what activates adenylate cyclase. So we'll just put this little G protein in here. Okay, and sort of in simple terms, that's what happens. So when we look at particular target organs, different effects are going to be activated by this second messenger mechanism. For instance, again, like the thyroid will start producing T4, and T3 is brought about from that, and that is a major regulator of your metabolic rate, your metabolism. You've heard of people with hyperthyroid, okay, where this whole process is sort of out of control, and so they have an accelerated metabolic rate. And one of the characteristic symptoms of hyperthyroidism is a thing called exophthalmos, where it looks like folks where their eyes appear as if they're sort of bugging out of the the orbit, the socket where the eyeball is. And what's actually happening is it's not really bugging out, but surrounding our eye is upper and lower are fat cells, and so they get reduced in size because of the high metabolic rate. So it gives the appearance as though
There was a British comic that had those bulging eyes.
Gene Wilder.
Yeah, right. Yeah. In that Frankenstein, young Frankenstein.
That's the one.
Yes.
Okay, and there'll be a couple of other hopefully there'll be a couple of other disorders that we'll look at. Okay, when some of these things don't work normally. But it's important to be able to distinguish between the steroid hormones and how they work. They don't have anything to do with this second messenger business, in that they work directly, have a direct effect on the DNA and gene expression. And then the others, the amines, peptides, glycoproteins, and so forth, work by this second messenger. It was called a hypothesis back in the day. Now it's called a mechanism, or it may even have made its way into some kind of theory or something by now. But anyhow, it doesn't matter. All right, two different ways in which these hormones work. All right, now there is a type of hormone that I want to mention because we'll see it again, and you may have heard of them, and they're called prostaglandins. And these are so-called like local hormones. They're secreted locally and they act locally. Prostaglandins. Okay, and They're synthesized from a substance called arachidonic acid. And we kind of refer to these as what we call local hormones. And they have a wide range of effects on the body, and including the pain mechanism and the perception of pain. All right, but just make a little note on that, because it's separated from the other hormones that generally travel throughout the body. These don't. These are what they refer to as local hormones, okay? All right, now, normally these hormones are secreted by a negative feedback mechanism. Okay, you remember what that is?
Yes, when one stimulus causes a reaction, and then the first stimulus reacts to the reaction.
Yeah, and in general, a negative feedback mechanism works to restore a set point. And these are homeostatic parameters that just are in the human body. Okay, so something goes up.
98.6, your temperature.
Your body temperature stays like that, hopefully most of your life, unless you're sick or freezing. But anyway, yeah. So we'll look at a couple of these sort of negative feedbacks, and one comes to mind that's pretty classic, and that's when you eat. Normal serum glucose. Here's just an example. Okay. Normally we run somewhere between 70 and 110 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, and so when we eat, depending upon what we eat, but when we eat carbohydrates primarily, our blood sugar goes up. And it'll exceed 110 milligrams per deciliter. All right, and there are osmoreceptors in the pancreas, and these beta cells of the pancreas. Okay, and they detect an increase in blood sugar, an increase in glucose, and they will release a hormone known as insulin. And what will happen is insulin, it is a protein hormone, okay, and insulin acts on virtually every cell in the body. There are these glycoreceptors or GLUT receptors in our fat cell, in our body cells, in the plasma membrane. And the upshot of this is that this insulin will stimulate the production of these, by this second messenger mechanism, okay, stimulate the synthesis of these GLUT receptors, and these will bind glucose molecules that are traveling in the blood, because glucose is a pretty big molecule, C6H12O6, and it can't readily diffuse through the plasma membrane, so it has to come across the plasma membrane by a facilitated diffusion process using this receptor as the facilitator, binds these sugar molecules, these glucose molecules, and moves them into the cell. The binding of the glucose to this receptor causes the receptor to change its conformation and it essentially just move the sugar into the cell so that the body can use it. Okay? And that will continue as long as the blood sugar remains above around 110. And when it comes back down, then the mechanism is shut off. That's negative feedback. Okay? Now, people with diabetes mellitus, there's a problem with their insulin. Either they're not producing enough of the insulin, or the insulin that they're producing is not, it's defective, it's not working properly, and these receptors are not being synthesized at an effective rate. So those people, what do they have to do? Well, they have to
inject artificial.
Yeah.
Artificial.
Yeah, and that's type 1 diabetes mellitus. And I say that because there's another type of diabetes. Okay, it used to be called, maybe it still is IDDM, insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. Okay, so they have to take exogenous insulin. More and more of the insulin being produced today is being done by recombinant DNA technology. In the old days, the source of the insulin was usually from pigs and cows, porcine and bovine insulin. They would extract it from the pancreas of these animals and purify it to the best that they were able, put it in a bottle, and it comes in doses called units, okay? And so you check your blood sugar, they put you on what they call a sliding scale, and if you're, depending upon what your blood sugar was, you may take 1, 2, 5 units of insulin until your blood sugar came back down. So people with type 1 or insulin-dependent diabetes oftentimes frequently have to check their blood sugar throughout the day, particularly before and after they eat. Okay. There's another type of diabetes. This used to be also called juvenile diabetes. I don't think that term is used anymore, but because you're more or less born with it. Now there's a type 2 or adult onset diabetes that is different, and it may or may not be insulin dependent. They may be able to take these oral sulfonylureas, to try to stimulate the pancreas to make more insulin, and oftentimes that's effective. And if it's not, then they may have to resort to insulin as well. And like I said, most of this is non-insulin dependent. We won't say that because it can be. We'll just call it adult onset. Okay. Nowadays, the insulin is produced, a lot of it is produced by bacteria. They take the human gene for insulin production, insert it into a bacteria by recombinant DNA technology, and then that bacteria in their metabolic processes produces insulin. And they're able to extract it. And it's, I know of a diabetic he's a very brittle diabetic, that's on that, and he has a tough time with it, but he has better luck with that than he had with the porcine and the bovine diabetes. Okay, anyway, classic example of a negative feedback mechanism, okay? There is another hormone called, that works by positive feedback. And if you remember, it's sort of the antithesis of the negative feedback. It will take a stimulus farther away from a set point. This hormone is known as oxytocin, released by the posterior pituitary. And what stimulates its release is, the last trimester of pregnancy, hopefully when the child has turned properly, and the head of the child putting pressure on the woman's cervix will send stimulus to the posterior pituitary gland, and they'll start to release the oxytocin. And oxytocin causes the uterus to contract. And the more the uterus contracts and pushes on the baby, and the baby's head pushes on the cervix, the cervix will efface, it'll flatten out, the more oxytocin is produced. And so it'll keep building and building until the fetus is expelled. And then the stimulus is gone, and so then it gets turned off. Eventually, we won't call it negative because the stimulus has been removed. So in a sense, it starts off in a positive feedback mechanism, but it eventually, hopefully, when the child is born, the stimulus is shut off. And then the oxytocin levels go down. However, they can come back up again, and they do come back up again when the child breastfeeds. Because that also, the suckling stimulates the release of this oxytocin, and one of the reasons they recommend breastfeeding is it helps to bring the uterus back down to its pre-pregnant state or size. Okay, so we can see that most of them work by negative feedback. Like this is probably the only positive feedback mechanism or hormone that I can think of right offhand. Okay, so if the question comes up, we'll say that most of them, they work by negative feedback. There's a stimulus, a hormone is released until the stimulus is removed to bring us back to a set point. Okay, now the so-called master gland, endocrine gland, is the pituitary gland. It's at the base of the hypothalamus, sits on a little stalk, and it sits in part of the sphenoid bone, a little saddle, Turk's saddle, or the sella turcica, to protect it. But it is the master gland, if you will. Has an effect on many, many, many other endocrine glands. Okay, that is the pituitary. And it is divided into two lobes. Two lobes. The anterior pituitary or the so-called adenohypophysis, and it has specific hormones, and we'll identify those, and then the posterior pituitary. Which is oftentimes referred to as the neurohypophysis. P-O-P-H-Y-S-I, yeah. Okay, now if we look at two basic lobes, different hormones come from these lobes. In fact, it's easy to remember the posterior pituitary because there's basically just two that come from there, and that is ADH and oxytocin. Okay, ADH is anti-diuretic hormone. This hormone is designed to work on the kidney tubules to reabsorb and conserve water. If you've ever noticed, back in our younger days when we were, involved in sports and playing basketball or football, most of the time that you're playing, you don't really have to pee much, and that's because the activity and the fluid levels in our body are such that this ADH hormone is released and helps us to conserve water. One of the things that will suppress the release of ADH is ethyl alcohol. So if you notice when you go out and watch a ball game in the bar with the boys and you start throwing down 3 or 4 beers, after a while you really got to start going pee, and you have to keep going pee because this ADH is not being produced, it's being suppressed, and so your kidney tubules are not reabsorbing proper amounts of water, and it ends up in the urine. And then again, oxytocin is the one that's involved with labor and delivery of a fetus. Okay. Now we'll look at the anterior pituitary hormones.